Chris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War, and I'm standing on the Fredericksburg battlefield. It's December 14th, 2022 as I shoot this, and it was 160 years ago today, as the story goes, that Sergeant Richard Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry left the safety of the sunken road behind me. He filled canteens up from the well of Martha Stevens, jumped the stone wall, and went into the open plain in front of the stone wall to bring water to the wounded and dying men of the Union Army that were scattered across the plain. Now, as we look off to my right, you can see that there's a neighborhood today, so it's a little hard to envision that had been 900 yards of open space all the way down to what was then the edge of town. Town has crept up since. But that plain was littered with the bodies of dead and dying men, men who were wounded, men who were just trapped out there by the incessant sharpshooting of the Confederates who were up there behind the stone wall. And so when Kirkland leaps the wall and goes out there, and all the firing goes silent once people realize what he's up to, his act of mercy earns him the nickname, the Angel of Marie's Heights. Kirkland's actions are commemorated with a statue here on the Fredericksburg battlefield, as well as a similar statue that's in front of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Of course, Fredericksburg is going to be a terribly lopsided loss for the Union Army, some 13,000 Union casualties compared to some only 5,000 Confederate casualties. And on the Union side of the river on this day, December 14th, fingers are already pointing as folks are trying to assign blame and avoid it. And just a couple days after the battle, members of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War will come to Burnside's headquarters in Stafford and meet at the Phillips House and conduct interviews with the principal players on the Union side to get a sense of what happened. Their testimony is available online. It's fascinating reading. I urge you to go and check it out for yourself. And it's pretty clear as you look at things that Burnside actually enjoyed pretty solid support from his senior commanders for the plan that he tried to execute here. And so it's only after the fact that a lot of people then started to try to scapegoat and assign blame. But one thing that does become pretty clear quickly is that the lack of pontoons at the start of the campaign really led to this defeat. In fact, there's a strong sense of that among the enlisted men. There are accounts of soldiers who are like, they should find out who was responsible for that and shoot him. They're just absolutely furious. They saw that right up front as a key culpability. In fact, a lot of the blame lays at the foot of Henry Halleck, General in Chief of the Army. Burnside knew well in advance that he was going to have to get across this river. He had told McClellan, when McClellan was still in command, the beginning of November, that they should move the pontoons, and McClellan actually agreed. On the 6th of November, McClellan sent orders for the pontoons to be moved from the upper reaches of the Potomac, where he had used them to cross the river into Virginia, and get them down closer to Washington for future operations. Before Burnside started his movement here on the 15th, he actually sends word back to Washington to just double check, is everything okay? And when his army gets here on the 17th, no pontoons, he's flummoxed and he's absolutely stymied on the far side of the river. And so when the pontoons do finally arrive, he's lost his element of surprise. Really, the fault, as I said, lays at the foot of Henry Halleck, who didn't put the hurry-up order, really delayed things as the events unfolded, had no sense of urgency whatsoever. Daniel Woodbury, chief engineer, shows up with the pontoons, and Burnside throws him under arrest, blaming him. And of course, he does bear some of the responsibility because he didn't move with alacrity either, but then he also just absolutely gets bogged down by terrible weather. When Burnside's temper finally cools and he's able to get a clearer sense of the situation, he releases Woodbury from imprisonment. And it really becomes clear that it's Halleck that bears the brunt of the responsibility, particularly through a lot of the testimony that the Joint Committee receives. However, Burnside can't really blame his boss, right? And so there's just going to be a lot of finger pointing, and Halleck, being the ever slippery guy that he is going to manage to weasel out of getting his share of the culpability there. And so really Burnside's going to have to carry a lot of the weight. And manfully he does. He's basically saying, hey, I'm the commander of this army. The buck stops here. The other key theme that comes out of the Joint Committee testimony that is collected those days after the battle is that Franklin on the south end of the field bears some culpability. If he had launched his attack, if he had taken a bit more initiative, if he had tried to clarify his orders, these things all start to come out. And so Franklin quickly realizes he's getting turned into a scapegoat, and he'll spend months trying to defend himself. When Joe Hooker becomes commander of this army in the early winter of '63, Franklin will refuse to serve under him, and so he'll basically be banished off first to York, Pennsylvania, and then eventually to the Trans-Mississippi. All that time, he will write letters in defense of his actions here. And in fact, he'll go so far in April of 1863 to publish a pamphlet that responds to the Joint Committee's report. By that point, Burnside is happily ensconced in Cincinnati in charge of the Department of the Ohio. He had survived this. He stayed in command. He did not get sacked. He'll go on to lead the ill-fated Mud March. He will then have a whole bunch of his subordinates, led by Franklin, try to stab him in the back. And Burnside's like, look, I can't handle this. And he asks to be relieved, and he is. But it's important to note that he does not get fired for Fredericksburg because the Joint Committee quickly realizes that there's a lot of culpability to go around. It's not just Burnside to blame here. But getting back to him in Cincinnati, where he gets his next posting, he finds out that all this controversy is still going on. The Chancellorsville campaign is underway, and Hooker's army gets beaten, and yet Franklin is still trying to refight Fredericksburg. And so Burnside will then respond on May 24th, the day after his 39th birthday, and talk a little bit more about what was going on and what his expectations were. And essentially says, I didn't give Franklin command half of the army in order for him to conduct a reconnaissance of force. But he does say that, as commander, he should have given more attention to that end of the battlefield than he did. He'd put too much faith in Franklin and Franklin's experience. Now, the person who probably deserves the most blame for the debacle at Fredericksburg is someone who doesn't get mentioned very often. Although Confederate artillerist Edward Porter Alexander made a pretty astute note and pinned the tail on the donkey. He said it was Abraham Lincoln's fault. That's an assessment I actually agree with, because Burnside realized when he got to the Rappahannock River and there were no pontoons, he'd lost his element of surprise, he had no good options of getting across the river safely, and he'd actually asked if he could call off the invasion or at least move the army down to the peninsula and attack that way, take a time out for winter, but he knew that getting across the Rappahannock was just going to lead to disaster. And Lincoln said that no, he couldn't take a break for winter. He needed to move. Burnside needed to move. Now, that's understandable because, of course, Abraham Lincoln has the Emancipation Proclamation that's supposed to go into effect on January 1st, 1863. He needs his army to do something to give some teeth to the Emancipation Proclamation. He's got to back it up with battlefield victories. So here we see the military and the political aspects of the war coincide in a way that really clash rather than work together. But, of course, the political cloud is really important. We remember that George McClellan got canned because he wasn't doing anything. Even before that, Don Carlos Buell got canned because he wasn't doing anything. So Burnside knows he really does have to do something. Even though he tries to explain to Lincoln that his options are terrible, Lincoln says, you've got to do something. And so he forces Burnside into this funnel of choices that get worse and worse with each decision he makes, trying to make the best decision he can out of a whole bunch of bad choices. And so that ultimately leads to this disaster, which really we could lay at the feet of Abraham Lincoln. So in these days after Fredericksburg, lots of finger pointing, lots of blaming going on, but a surprising amount of consensus too, if you read some of that testimony. Of course, Burnside is criticized for what goes on here today. We kind of think of him as being an idiot for sending his men against this sunken road and stone wall. But if you read the reports for yourself, you'll see that there's actually a lot more to this story than popular memory tends to believe. Here in the Fredericksburg battlefield, on the 160th anniversary of the Aftermath of Battle, I'm Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. We'll see you online and here on the battlefield.